So this video called Focusing Themes is one of two videos, and what's meant by focusing themes is basically a kind of run through of the history of the civilization of the world. I don't find too many questions in GED social studies on this, but it's in the syllabus and you can get them. Remember, you don't have to learn this all by heart. You really need to understand it, because the questions that you're going to be asked will probably have a lot of the information inside the question. It's just understanding the background to the question which is going to help you to answer it correctly. So when you look at where civilization started, you might think it would start in where the most developed countries are today. Actually, that's far from true. If you go back to the most early civilizations, they happened in countries that are much less developed today. If we take, for an example, Myanmar, and we compare it with England, if you go back 2,000 years, Myanmar is a much more civilized country than England ever was. You had in Myanmar the most amazing early civilization, whereas in England it was very primitive. Our civilization was much slower to develop. For civilization, humans really need time to think about other things than simply staying alive. Human life needs a good climate, ready sources of food and fresh water. These were things that were there in Myanmar 2,000 years ago, but in England they weren't there. Once you have a surplus of food, you can find water easily. Life becomes easier, and people have spare time. And when they've got spare time, they can think about enjoying themselves. They can think about educating themselves. And they can start to think about religion. Why are we here? What is our purpose? How should we lead our life? Myanmar versus England. If you go back 2,000 years, look what was being built in Myanmar compared to what was being built in England. It tells you all you need to know about what a wonderful civilization you had 2,000 years ago, and what a primitive civilization we had in England. You've got the Bagan, I think that must be Bagan in the picture there, and then you've got Stonehenge in England. Many people talk about civilization coming with the Bronze Age. The first civilizations in the world we think developed around 5,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, which is Iran, Syria. Actually, Egypt is not the Fertile Crescent, but it had a fertile area too around the Nile River. The Bronze Age came slightly after that, 500 years after that. And when we say the Bronze Age is when people discovered that if you mix copper and tin together to make your tools and your weapons, you find that your tools and weapons are much stronger. And the picture there is the picture from Egypt. I'm sure you all recognize it, the Egyptian pyramids. And these are some of the first Egyptian pyramids ever built, and they were built around 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BC. The first civilization started in this area, which is today is kind of Iraq, Syria area, and it was called Mesopotamia. And the Mesopotamians and the Mesopotamian Empire, and later the Babylonian Empire, in pretty similar places here. Mesopotamia had the first ever written language, the first organized religion, knowledge of maths. They invented the wheel and produced the first ever book. The people of Mesopotamia were called the Sumerians, and they built cities. We found through archaeologists lots of signs of this early civilization. They were designing luxury objects, designing jewellery, musical instruments, and games. And here is an example of some Mesopotamian writing that's almost 5,000 years old. Soon after the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, a new empire came up, which was the Babylonian Empire, and they conquered the Sumerians. And we're now thinking about 4,000 years ago, this Babylonian Empire developed. They were great experts on the stars, and they followed the sun. They were, like the Sumerians, good mathematicians. And also they brought in a whole system of laws, the most famous of which was the Code of Hammurabi. At the same time in Egypt, we were getting another civilization developing quite separately from the Babylonians. And as you know, one of their more important buildings were the pyramids, and these became more and more complex as they got better at it. In China, again, completely separate from the Babylonians, a great civilization was arriving there. It really got going about 3,000 years ago. And we can see this from their early writings. The Chinese learnt about silk from silkworms and how to use it to make beautiful clothes, producing chopsticks, beautiful ceramic and jade objects. The Chinese settled on riverbanks, completely separate from what was happening in much further west. They had a famous philosopher, Confucius. Confucius designed a way for society to work and to thrive, which is still very much alive today. And this society was based on individual respect and also an individual's duty to his community. The Han Dynasty, which came a little bit later in the Chinese civilization, using much of what was originally built. The Han Dynasty was about 2,000 years ago, just over. And with this Han Dynasty, the country thrived, had a free market economy, again, a strong law code. Paper was invented. And the Chinese opened up trade with the West, and more than trade, the famous Silk Road that many of you may know about already. And it produced not only a great wealth to the country, but through exporting, but they also imported new goods and new ideas. Here is the Silk Road. Known as the Silk Road, it carried not just silk, but lots of other things, like paper and porcelain, spices, cotton. The goods didn't just come from China, they were picked up along the way. So from India, spices and cotton came. From Iran came horses. And in return, the Europeans exported things like luxury goods. The Silk Road was not just important to China, it was also extremely important to Europe. It was our most important trade route too. And at the very end of that Silk Road in the west, you can see in the east it starts in China, but in the west it ends up in Italy. And cities like Genoa and Venice also became very wealthy as a result of this Silk Road. India. Here we have just a very simple map of India. India too had a strong early civilization. Buddhism started in India. Buddhism today, Buddhism has now been replaced by Hinduism in India, and you also find many Muslims and Christians in the country. India was invaded first by the Muslim Mughals, and then by the British, and the Muslim Mughals brought Islam and the British brought Christianity. In Europe, Greece is seen as the great early culture. This culture emerged around 4,000 years ago, and in Europe it was our first European culture. Greece was a series of separate kingdoms until Macedonia unified the country just over 2,400 years ago. And having emerged into one strong civilization, Alexander the Great had built a strong empire, moving east as far as Pakistan. Greece was also very important to the birth of European philosophy, and it's actually very important birth of democracy, which is an important topic within GED social studies. Greek philosophy believed that if you really thought about things, you could understand everything. You could understand the workings of the universe if you really thought deeply about it. They had, as well as a strong philosophy, they had great literature with wonderful stories. And their literature produced stories that are a mixture of their history and also their myths. The Greeks believed in many different gods. There was a god of the sea, a god of the sky, a god of wisdom, a god of love, a god of music. There were thousands of little gods. During this Greek classical age, which I would say is sort of, from 750 BC to 400 BC, so you're looking at 2,500 years ago, maybe a little bit more, the Greeks developed this idea of democracy, this idea that people would vote for government, for decisions to be made. This idea of democratic government wasn't massively inclusive because people voting were really only men allowed to vote and only free landowning men allowed to vote. But it was a start. And as well as philosophy and this invention of democracy, they also were great pioneers of art, architecture, science, and literature, not just wonderful stories, but poetry too. And again, democracy. We will discuss more about democracy and how the Greeks started democracy in the forms of government video, which you may or may not have seen. Rome. So next door to Greece, just a little bit westwards, was Italy and the Roman Empire in Italy. The Roman Empire started 2,500 years ago and lasted 1,000 years. And it became the greatest civilization in Europe, conquering most of Europe, including Greece. The Romans, while great conquerors, were also quite tolerant rulers. If Rome conquered you, and they conquered England, as long as the people obeyed Roman law, paid their taxes, and were loyal to the state, they were allowed to lead their own lives pretty much. They had to worship the Roman gods, but they could worship their own gods too. The Roman gods actually were quite similar to the Greek gods. Many of the Roman myths and religions came from Greece. The Romans too produced great literature. But much of the Roman culture is actually, they actually got quite a lot from Greece. They were great at things like law, government, engineering. The Roman language was Latin. I learned Latin at school. Latin was such an important language in Europe that it was almost the language of educated people for over 1,000 years. I also actually learnt ancient Greek at school. Here you can see the Roman Empire and how far it stretched across much of Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, including England. And you can see that if you see in England, you can see that they conquered England, but they didn't conquer Scotland. That the Romans found the Scots too unruly, and so rather than try to conquer them, they built a wall, which I have visited. And that wall was built almost 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago. and it stretches all the way from the west to the east coast of England, and it was designed to keep the Scots out. You can see on the right-hand side of the map, that square, I hope it's clear for you, that's actually where a Roman garrison was based. And I visited that ruin of the Roman garrison. And in one corner, you can still find the toilets that the garrison soldiers used. Rome in 2,500 years ago became a republic, and there was a Senate with representatives, and those representatives were a mixture of patricians and commoners, patricians and plebeians, and the plebeians, the common people. Those representatives of the common people had veto power over the aristocrats. But the republic didn't last, and became a dictatorship just over 2,000 years ago. By the 4th century AD, so that is 1,600 years ago, just over, the Roman Empire almost got too big for itself. It became so big that it was hard to manage and had to be split into two halves. And when things like this are split into two halves, it doesn't normally create a happy situation. And the eastern half and the western half squabbled with each other, and eventually Constantinople, which was the eastern half, based out of Istanbul, with the western half continuing to be based out of Rome, broke away from Rome completely and formed their own empire called the Byzantine Empire. Christianity. So again, in the 4th century, Rome changed their religion from worshipping many gods to Christianity. There's a story that in AD 312 AD, and remember, you don't have to remember these dates, there was an emperor of Rome called Constantine who had a dream. And the dream said that he would win a battle that he was about to fight. He would win this battle on condition that his troops painted Christian crosses on their shields. And being a big believer in dreams, when he woke the next morning, he decided that his soldiers should indeed paint these Christian crosses on their shields. And having done that, they won the battle. The battle was called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. So after this, the emperor declared that the Roman Empire would become Christian. While the Roman Empire did become Christian, I talked about the two halves of the empire not coexisting happily together. And there was a split in what kind of Christianity they would follow. And the Western half chose Roman Catholicism, and the Eastern half chose Eastern Orthodoxy. This wasn't the first time or this may be the first time in Europe that that Christian church split in two. It certainly wasn't the last. So with this Roman Empire, which lasted 1,000 years, got too big for itself. Empires, as empires do, like the British Empire, it declined. It declined first in the West. Powerful tribes, the Goths, not very civilized tribes, but very warlike tribes, attacked them from the north. Also, the way that Rome became wealthy was through conquering new lands, and having conquered new lands, bringing people from those new lands as slaves. As Rome conquered fewer new lands, there were fewer new slaves. And with that, the economy suffered a lot, because the Rome economy needed more and more new slaves all the time. In the East, the empire was much stronger. They didn't have the Goths attacking them. And it lasted 1,000 years longer than the Western Empire. And it was actually only beaten about 600 years ago by the rise of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. There were other changes going on in Central Asia, where nomadic tribes like the Huns, which inhabited, it says here, the steppes of Central Asia. This was a large mountain range, um, and they moved west. They were very good horsemen. They learnt to use iron, and the wheel had already been invented, but they invented wheels with spokes. And as these nomadic tribes moved into Europe in waves with very strong armies and cavalry, they drove out many of the European tribes, including the Goths. Um, and that forced the Goths to move further southwards, and they then attacked Rome. There was another European tribe called the Franks. They were strong in France, and they took over a lot of Western Europe: France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. In the UK, we also had migration into the UK. In the Iron Age, many Celtic people came from Europe to settle. The Romans came to and took over England and Wales. About 2,000 years ago, they invaded England and Wales. As you remember from the map, they took over England and Wales, but they didn't take over Scotland. They built that wall. When the Romans left England and Wales, they were. It wasn't the last time we were invaded. We had tribes coming over the sea from Germany and from Scandinavia, and they started by attacking on the east coast of Britain, our towns, and eventually started settling there. And these tribes were called Angles, Saxons, and later Vikings. We have the term Anglo-Saxon, and that refers to people whose heritage, whose ancestry you can trace back to Angles or Saxons. I am probably come from an Angle or Saxon heritage, because the Angles and the Saxons brought blue eyes to England and fair hair. The last people to invade England were the Normans. They came from France in 1066, and their ruler William, we now know as William the First or William the Conqueror, successfully conquered England and became our king. In a famous battle in 1066 called the Battle of Hastings, where he defeated the English King Harold. And here you can see a tapestry that was made in just after the battle in 1066, the Bayeux tapestry of the Battle of Hastings. You may be thinking, gosh, he's given me so much information. How do I remember all of this? Remember that GED is not about learning lots of things. It's about understanding it. If you get questions on these early civilizations, they won't be expecting you to know everything. It's simply, you've got a background. So when you get a piece of writing which is discussing something like this, you might think, oh yes, this is one of those early civilizations. This is the Egyptians. This is Rome. This is Greece. So please don't be scared. Feudalism. So in Europe, and actually also China, India, and Japan, there was a system to manage society. Not a very fair system, but a system that largely worked. And it was a system where the powerful dominated the unpowerful. So if you were one of the common people, which most people were, you had a local lord who ruled you, and he really had total control over your life. The local lord would allow you to farm your lands, or those lands might really be his lands, but in return you would need to pay him tax, which would be money, or it might be some of the wheat that you grow, or some of the cattle that you tend, and you would also have to be loyal to that lord. In turn, the lord would have to show loyalty to the king, and the king would demand from the lords as well as loyalty, money, taxes. And also, when the king needed an army to fight, the lords would need to provide men to fight, and these would be taken from the common people that were in turn giving loyalty to the Lord. I say it largely worked, but there were conflicts. The powerful lords sometimes objected to the king if he asked for too much money and too much loyalty. There was the church too, and the church, the Christian church, their ruler was not the king, it was the Pope in Rome and God. And so the relationship between the king and the church was often quite a difficult one. An example of when the king did not get on with the lords is what caused the Magna Carta. So if we go back to the Silk Road map, the Silk Road was as important to Europe as it was to China, and for quite some while it operated happily. But with the rise of Islam and the Islamic Empire, which started in Saudi Arabia, started around here, and then quickly spread, the Islamic Empire started to control a number of these areas that the Silk Road passed through, and a number of the ports, because a lot of ships sailed from Israel, Lebanon, Syria, up into Europe. And as the Islamic Empire started to control this, they caused problems. They wanted commission, they wanted control, and that made the Silk Road much less profitable for the Europeans, and they didn't like it. Let's go back to where we were before. So the Europeans fought crusades, and these crusades were a number of European countries, Christian countries, and the crusades for them was a fight of Christianity against Islam, but actually it was a fight of trade. But these crusades were very expensive, and England was broke as a result of it, and the lords were fed up with having to give the king more and more money. And in 1215, the lords in England rebelled against the king's commands and demands, and they said no. And the king was forced to sign a document that limited his powers and meant that he had to accept certain laws. It actually led to the parliamentary system that England would later adopt. The Magna Carta also becomes very important in American history. So we're looking at more than 500 years later, the Americans are saying, actually, we want the same limits to powers that the Magna Carta gave to England to be given to us. But we'll discuss that when we're discussing American history. Islam, I talked about the importance of this new Islamic empire. So in the 7th century, so that's the 600s, the Prophet Muhammad brought Islam to the Middle East. He was born in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and the Islamic empire grew very dramatically. It grew across Africa into Europe, including Spain and some of France. North Africa, it spread eastwards. They took over the Christian home of Jerusalem. And again, importantly, they interrupted ports in Israel and Lebanon on the Silk Road and made trade on the Silk Road much more difficult for the Europeans. And it was this that brought the Europeans into war. And the Crusades were really only partially successful. And here you can see a map of the Islamic Empire stretching from Pakistan in the east, all the way across Persia, now Iran, Iraq, Syria, and then all across North Africa. And much of this area is still are still Muslim countries today. Spain and France managed to repel the Islamic Empire, and those are now Christian countries. But you can see just what a dramatic spread that was of the Islamic Empire. Islam is the Islamic faith. Islam, the word Islam means peace. The word Muslim means man of peace. Islam's holy book is called the Quran. And when you read it, you find many of the same stories that you get in the Jewish and the Christian Old Testament Bibles. The God that Muslims worship is the same God that Christians and Jews worship. Muslims believe in Jesus, but they just believe that Jesus was a prophet. There are huge similarities between these religions. When Muhammad, as well as bringing Islam, also united the tribes, the Arab tribes, many of the Arab Bedouin tribes were not united before that, and there was occasional conflict. But in uniting them all together, they became a very powerful force. And this led to this very dramatic increase in size of the Islamic Empire. And to think that they ruled much of Spain for almost 800 years. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, actually within a day or so of him dying, there was the first religious split in Islam. Just like Christianity, Islam split. Some people felt on Muhammad's death that his son Ali should have become the new ruler, but others supported Abu Bakr, who was the senior cleric at the time. And today we have in Islam, we have two important sects: the Shia, who are the people that believe that Ali should have become the new ruler, and the Sunni, who believe it was correct that Abu Bakr was made the new ruler. As well as having this strong army and growing a massive empire, Islam was also a culture with great civilization, great artists, poets, and mathematicians. The center of the Islamic Empire moved over time. Sometimes it was in Saudi, sometimes it was further east, and from the 15th century, the Islamic Empire actually became controlled out of Turkey, as the Ottoman Empire took over Constantinople from the Byzantine Empire. But the Ottoman Empire did gradually cease to grow and lost power and influence in the world. Africa. So many of the most advanced civilizations in Africa came in the north of the continent: Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, along the Nile River. But there were also kingdoms that flourished due to trading. Ghana in West Africa, and the island of Zanzibar, which is Zanzibar is an island off Tanzania in East Africa. But Africa suffered a lot. It was plundered by Arabs and Europeans who used it as a huge source of slavery, and millions of Africans were taken as slaves. 25 million Africans were taken as slaves to go and work in the Americas, many of whom died on the journey across the Atlantic. The Americas. So in America, before it was discovered by Christopher Columbus, American Indians had extensive trade with each other. The Great Plains Indians, which is right in the middle of America, traded with those of the eastern woodlands. The Iroquois, which was an important Indian tribe had a very sophisticated alliance of different groups that worked together. Further south in Mexico, into South America, we saw we see for examples of the Maya and the Aztec, very sophisticated tribes building incredible cities and temples. They had an accurate calendar and a writing system. The Inca tribe further south in the Andes Mountains were the most incredible engineers, and some of the cities that they built and the buildings that they've built today, we just cannot understand how they could build buildings just so in such a sophisticated way so long ago. But with the arrival of the Europeans in the 16th century, these civilizations were destroyed. That is the end of the first run through of the history of civilization. Don't worry if you think, gosh, how will I remember all of this? You don't need to remember it all. You just need to understand it. So if you like, what you could try to do is watch it more than once